Ladies and gentlemen, this is Nate Crespo, your host for today and forever. And welcome back to another episode of the Lawyers in the Making podcast, where it is my job to focus on unique journeys to the law and law school of professionals in the legal field and law students. As well, check us out, new Substack, lawyersinthemaking.substack.com. Sign up there, find all the content there. It's a wonderful thing. Let's talk about what we're doing today. Enough about me. Today, we have another spectacular guest. She is a University of Mississippi School of Law graduate and currently works as a partner at Husch Blackwell. She has held past positions as an associate at Quarles and Brady and as a law clerk at the United States Courts. I'm super duper excited to have her on the podcast today. Mrs. Emily Logan Stedman, welcome to the podcast. How are we doing today?
Hi, Nate. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, as I said, I'm just as excited. I'm ready to go today, very energetic. But Emily, before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, or a suburb of Atlanta. I now live in Milwaukee, where I am a partner in commercial litigation. I help businesses of all sizes address potential and existing contract disputes through all aspects of litigation and pretty much in all courts and arbitration forums.
Well, let's go back, all the way back to the wonderful year of 2008. I was 5 years old. I really got to stop doing that. I have to stop doing I can't control myself sometimes. I know. See, I get those reactions, and then I think to myself, I'm like, Nate, you have to stop doing that. But the years just line up. It's so easy to say. I don't mean to offend anyone. I don't mean to offend anyone. It just means you're more experienced than me. That's a great thing. But in 2008, you graduated from Wake Forest University, and you eventually ended up 2 years later at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Now, Emily, simply put, why'd you go to law school? Why'd you do it?
Yeah, so my answer is not the most exciting. Both my parents are attorneys. My birth announcement is a joke about me being their newest associate, because my mom was actually a first year when I was born and my dad was already practicing. So it's Stedman and Stedman welcome their newest associate. That's my birth announcement. And it hung in my room growing up, as many Southern children have their birth announcements on the wall. And I probably would have told you at about age 12 or 10 even that I was going to be a lawyer when I grew up. But Wake Forest was extremely intense academically, and I was on the verge of burnout from being a student. So I had learned about Teach for America in high school, made it my goal to try to get in and go. And I actually took the LSAT at the same time that I was applying to Teach for America. And I just told myself, if I get into TFA, I'll go do that. If I don't, I'll go to law school. I ended up getting into Teach for America. I taught fifth grade for 2 years in Phoenix, Arizona, in a rural suburb of Maricopa County. And I loved teaching. I loved being a fifth grade teacher. I loved my students. But it was the height of, or the tail end of the recession. Phoenix was a weird place at the time. I didn't love Phoenix. So I said, I've always wanted to go to law school. I'll give it a try. And if I hate it, I'll go home to Atlanta and I'll teach fifth grade the rest of my life. And I specifically looked for a law school that would not be as academically overwhelming or intense as my undergrad. I did fine at Wake, ended up graduating with honors, but I wasn't the most social person. It was a lot of resume building and studying for 4 years straight. So I ended up applying to Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. Everyone who I talked to about it only had positive things to say about their experience there. And so I packed up, drove across the country, and started law school.
No, I think it's a wonderful tale. I don't think it's that boring, like you said. I think that's a very wonderful thing. This is actually you're the second guest on the podcast to work for Teach for America. Ted Gomes, I believe that was episode 21. He had done some teaching previously before he went to law school. And so I have the same question that I asked him. How did teaching for those 2 years sort of shape your perspective going throughout law school, and how did it help you?
Yeah, so teaching absolutely laid the foundation. One, it continued my time management skills from college and took them to the next level. People bash teaching, say it's not that hard. It was the hardest 2 years of my life. And there's so much, particularly when you teach fifth grade and are in charge of all the main subjects. Like time management is critical to get through everything. And I also honed public speaking for me. And so I'm a litigator today, and talking to a jury is not that different than talking to a classroom of 10-year-olds. I think it helped me go into law school and treat law school like a job. And because of that, and because I found that to be so, so helpful, when anyone asks me if they should go to law school, I say, well, maybe, but you should work before you go. Almost all my closest friends, except for very few from law school, worked for at least a year before they went to law school. And I think that does a couple things. One, it makes you appreciative of being a student again, right? So, like as a teacher, I couldn't go to the bathroom whenever I wanted. I couldn't go to the grocery store in the middle of the day. As a student, I had a little more flexibility in my day. Also, it gives you just a little bit of a real world perspective. So even if you wait tables for a year, you're getting that people to people interaction. You're learning how to listen. Maybe you've signed a contract, like a lease or something like that. So you have at least a little bit of a real world perspective to anchor some of the things you're going to learn about that first year.
So let's go to the first year. Let's talk about the first year. Some people hate it. Some people absolutely love it. The 2 episodes ago, which isn't out yet, Scott Oliver told me it was one of his favorite years of his life, and now I'm going to use him every single time I ask this question. So, Emily, how is it for you?
So I adore Scott. We run in the same circles on LinkedIn and Twitter. I agree with Scott. I loved law school. If we're gonna go chronologically, we'll get to the one part that gave me some heartburn. But I loved law school. I don't know if any other schools do this. When I went to Ole Miss, they had a program where you could take 2 classes in the summer before your first year. So I took constitutional law, no, excuse me, I took civil procedure one and criminal law one in a cohort of 10 students over 8 weeks in the summer. And that really got me back into the mindset of being a student. I was fortunate enough to have done very well in those 2 classes, and that just set me up because I knew what to expect. The hardest thing about being a first year law student, and I tell law students this all the time, or undergrads who are thinking about going to law school, is that there's usually one test, no papers. In legal writing, there will be papers, but there's one exam. It's at the end of the semester. If your teacher hasn't given you a practice run, you have no clue what it's going to be like. That's the hardest part. And I think really no matter how well or poorly you think you've done that first semester, there's room to grow from there because now you know what to expect. I did go to Ole Miss, which is in the SEC, so I also very much took advantage of the football program and took breaks on the weekends to go to SEC football games, and that helped me find a lot of balance that I did not have in undergrad.
So, in terms of there only being one test, what are some ways people can prepare diligently and be able to be fully prepared for that test and not nervous and have that anxiety on that test day?
Yeah, so the bulk of your classes, you're going to be reading cases and having to summarize them, and then potentially be on call in class to take questions. Don't get behind. Read and reread the cases if you can. Take notes and just stay diligent. And what helped me with that, which I mentioned a little earlier, is treating law school like a job. I got there when the law library opened every weekday morning and stayed at night until my work was done. Sometimes that meant I stayed till dinner. Sometimes that meant I was only there till noon. But having that habit and routine meant I never fell behind. And then I could take those breaks along the way. The other thing, and I should have done more than this, almost every teacher will share past exams, or the library might even have a database of them. Ask to see them, run through them, talk to your professors about the answers. Also, befriend second and third year law students. You'll do a thing called outlining. I had never heard of this when I got to law school. Like, yes, I had certain privileges because both my parents were attorneys, but there were still some things I had no clue about, like outlining. It's legitimately an outline. It outlines the rules and cases and the constitutional amendments or criminal laws. I never made my own. You can, but I would recommend not starting from scratch. So ask upperclassmen if they have outlines you can share. I
Yeah.
could probably go on and on, but I'll stop
Oh,
there.
oh no, I think it was extremely sufficient and you're making extremely great points. I'd say the one point that I have never heard before is the past exams. I've never heard that on this podcast. So that's something brand new. And I'm always loving to learn things. And I feel like at this point, I know so much. I think I know a little too much about law school nowadays, but something new is always wonderful. And I didn't even know that they could have had past exams available. That's actually incredibly useful now that I think about it. And the fact that they had the two summer classes, I've never heard of that as well.
Yeah, I
Another
don't
new thing.
think it's very common.
But let's move forward since we're seemingly going some chronological order here. But you talked about there was a point in law school you had a little heartburn. I'd like to ask about that heartburn if it's all right with you. Describe a little bit what this heartburn was.
So there's a thing called OCIs, which means on-campus interviews. And if you do well, you're sort of shoved into them. And I was fortunate to do well, largely because I treated it like a job. And I found balance with socializing. And OCIs were incredibly difficult for me, both at the end of first year for that summer after 1L year, and then again in the fall of the second year for jobs after your second year of law school. I got a ton of them and only got one summer job from them. In the Deep South, a lot of the law schools and firms still do split summers. So you're at one law firm for 4 weeks and another law firm for 4 weeks. Where I am in the Midwest, now the summers are one program. So you're at a law firm or in a legal department for 8 to 10 weeks. I basically struck out both summers, except for my second summer when I got a externship with a judge. And law firms, a lot of them would not give you a straight answer. It was essentially ghosting before ghosting became a word in pop culture. And it was very, very difficult because I would start to get a sense that I wasn't getting an offer, but you wouldn't hear from them. And it was really just disheartening. And I tell people it's the one thing in law school that made me cry. Like it was very, very difficult, even though I had done very, very well as a student.
So let's talk about the law clerkship you had at the U.S. courts. How was that experience? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What'd you learn? Everything like that.
Yeah, so my mom, I mentioned before, my mom was a first year law student when I was born. So fast forward several years because she went part-time at night. She became a law clerk for our local state court judge, Judge Flournoy. And I remember her being a clerk, and he became like a member of our family. And so I knew pretty quickly in law school that I wanted to litigate and I wanted to clerk. So first thing I did was the summer after my second year, I got a job with a judge, and I ended up working for a bankruptcy judge in Jackson, Mississippi. And that confirmed for me that I wanted to clerk. It also taught me how isolating clerking can be, because you're literally just in an office with chambers, which is usually very small groups, researching and writing all day. And that probably would turn some people off. So if you're interested in clerking, I highly recommend working for a judge at some point during law school. My clerkship story is sort of wild in that in the fall of my 3L year, a judge in North Carolina, a bankruptcy judge, hired me to be his law clerk for 2 full years after I graduated. Fast forward to April of 2013, almost exactly 1 month before I graduated, he called me to tell me he wasn't going to be a judge anymore, and I no longer had my clerkship. And, we're now nearly 11 years later, and I still remember where I was when I got the call. He was very gracious, connected me with his network. I had signed a lease for an apartment in North Carolina. I had signed up to take the North Carolina bar exam, and I had stayed in touch with the judge I interned for in Mississippi. And he happened to be complaining about what was happening to me to a woman at a judge's conference named Judge Pepper. And she said to him, "My clerk is leaving, tell her to apply." So I applied and I interviewed by video from Mississippi with Judge Pepper, who sat in Milwaukee. I'd never been to Wisconsin. It was the day before I graduated law school, so my whole family was in town. I told them, "I've never been to Wisconsin, but if she offers me the job, I'm going to take it." And literally a month later, I moved to Milwaukee and started my clerkship. I'd never been to Wisconsin before in my life. So that's how I got there. The clerkship itself was a great experience. I started with my judge in bankruptcy court. She was then nominated by President Obama to move up to the district court. So I got to see that process from the inside out, which was literally like a privilege of a lifetime. You learned so much about cases. You learned so much from watching attorneys and reading their papers, that really the biggest thing you learn from clerking is what not to do, what judges don't like, what doesn't read well, what doesn't sit well. The Eastern District of Wisconsin is a fairly small but collegial court. So I got to know all the courthouse staff, a bunch of other clerks. I still know a lot of the judges, and they know me. And that has just been critically important to my career in litigation in Milwaukee.
Yeah, something that's becoming very apparent is these law clerkships are absolutely immense for people. They've done so much. And something that you said at the end, figuring out what not to do, is something they always key in on. And they always talk about with these clerkships that the judges will have lunch with their clerks all the time. They'll talk to them all the time. They make sure they're involved, make sure they're learning. So I think it's really important for people to hear how valuable clerkships can be, because you really get that pure, authentic one-on-one experience with the professional in the field, especially a judge who, him or her probably been doing it for 20 plus years. So someone with such a plethora of experience can support you so much. And I think that's absolutely amazing.
And I would add one thing, people put a lot of emphasis on federal clerkships. And I understand why, but I would not limit yourself to that. So, right, I ended up getting a district court clerkship because I started in bankruptcy court. A ton of people do that. But if you know where you want to live and practice long term, a state court clerkship can be immensely valuable and credibility building if that's where you want to live, work, and practice. I have a friend who clerked for a state court judge in northern Alabama. She's now a state's attorney in that county. So she works with those judges all day, every day. And so don't limit yourself to like a federal clerkship if you want to clerk. It's so much more than just a box check if you let it be.
That is a fantastic point right there. And something that I love to highlight, that each experience, positive or negative, are still a lesson learned. It's still an experience in itself, and that's what we're there for. And I think that's such an important point to make. But just to back up a little bit and
Mhm.
ask, since you are a litigator yourself, how did you figure out this is what I want to do? I want to litigate for the rest of my life.
Yeah, so that too goes back to my parents. So my dad was general counsel for an insurance company. And I knew I didn't want to do that type of corporate law. My mom was in a small practice, a small firm, and then eventually became a juvenile court judge. So she was always on the litigation side. And honestly, other than my dad being in insurance, I would not have known or used the word transactional law probably until 3 year. It just wasn't really in my frame of reference. So I always wanted to litigate. When I went to law school, I would have told you, like similar to what you were describing to me before we jumped on the episode, that I would have been a public defender or a criminal prosecutor. I wanted to be a public servant. I wanted to give back in that way. Some people hearing this might think being a big law attorney is literally the opposite of giving back and being a public servant. But big firms give back in a lot of ways, and I get to do some really sophisticated work, and businesses are ultimately made of people. And if they're suing someone or being sued, they have a problem that they need fixing. And sure, sometimes it is just about money, but a lot of times it's a promise broken. It's employees' jobs on the line. It's more than just money most of the time and in a lot of ways. So I do feel like I'm serving others in that regard.
So I'd like to now that I was going back, I'd like to fast forward really fast here. You're right now, well, you were a senior associate commercial litigator at, is it Husch Blackwell? Did I say that right?
Mhm.
I always have a nice guessing game with myself with all those names. But just recently of this year, you became a partner. Congratulations on that. I know I'm late to the party, but I always like to get my congratulations in when I can. Um, but something that I saw on LinkedIn, because you're very popular on LinkedIn, I was saying that before, and of the past couple months, you've been really blowing up. And something you like to talk about is demystifying big law. That, like you said, you're still doing a good service to the community. You're still doing a good service to people. Can you talk a little bit about that, about demystifying what big law is? Because it's a very big word, and people talk about it a lot on this podcast and have in the past. So let's hear the demystification of it all.
Okay, first, what is big law? So the American Lawyer or AmLaw puts out a scale. It's usually talked about in the AmLaw 100, AmLaw 200. They're the biggest firms in order by profit per partner. And so when most people talk about big law, they're talking about these very, very huge and very, very high billable hour rate or billing rate per hour in New York City, Chicago, LA, sometimes San Francisco. But big law is really much more than that. So my firm currently sits at number 81 on the AmLaw scale, and our headquarters is the Midwest. So you don't have to be a coastal firm to be big law. And then sometimes even in the Southeast, there are these regional firms, and we actually have one in Milwaukee that are smaller firms, but I call them big law adjacent. They have the same feel as my firm. They're doing the same work as my firm. The people who work there, their resumes look just like mine. And if you do well in law school, you're often pushed towards big law. That is fine. But what I think gives people trouble is they don't do any research. They don't talk to people who are in big law and they have no clue what they're getting into. They do summer programs, which are notoriously not a one-to-one of what it's actually like to be an associate. And then they become an associate and it's like the rug's been pulled out from under them. It's super intense, super competitive, overwhelming, draining, a nightmare for your mental health. I think a lot of that happens for one, because you're just pushed to big law and no one talks about what it's actually like. Or two, once we're in there, we don't talk about what it's actually like. And so, is it hard work? Yes. Are there high expectations? Yes. Like most attorneys who are firm owners or work for a firm, you have to track your time in 6-minute increments and potentially hit a certain number of hours each year. But it's also so much more than that. And if you manage it and go in eyes wide open, it doesn't have to be a burnout, miserable, push you to the edge of your physical and mental health experience.
So something I had wrote down, I make a little note sheet before I come into these things. And something I wrote down was does not like billable hours slash very much focuses on mental health. Can you talk about your dislike for billable hours as well as the awareness of mental health, especially in the legal industry? And I've seen statistics before, and it gets a little crazy in terms of in the legal industry, how many people become addicts, how many people have become depressed, so on and so forth. So I think it's first, really, really important that you talk about these things tonight, especially on LinkedIn. I've seen you talk about it numerous times, but to just get the message out that, at the end of the day, with a lot of the people in the legal industry, you're not alone. But I'll let you take it away because you're the expert, not me.
That's exactly how I got started on the mental health front. So, going into and just before the pandemic, I was not in a great space. And I was often sitting at work thinking, I'm the only one having a hard time. I'm the only one wondering if I'm cut out for this long term. And I very slowly but surely started to talk openly about that with one, I got lucky. I had a close coworker who's still a dear friend who shared with me and I shared with him. And then with my friends and then with my family. And I realized we're all having a hard time. Like this is an intense work environment. And I just started talking about it. I eventually did burn out. I was crying every day, having some pretty intense thoughts, and I did seek help. I've had a therapist since I joined Big Law. And my goal is really to destigmatize it because humans have a mental health problem, not just attorneys. And then it's exacerbated amongst attorneys because there's such a stigma around it and you being weak or not cut out if you have a problem or you ever have doubts about yourself or the job. And that's just not true. And I like my job. Like 90% of the time, I really like my job. So I started to try to find ways to support my mental health and make the job more sustainable. One of those things was taking control of the billable hour. The billable hour could fill up 100 episodes of a podcast on its pros and cons. For me, it's just a reality. I've come to a place, I've worked really hard for it to just be a neutral thing in my life. It's just a requirement of my job. And I think reframing it that way and constantly monitoring it so I know if I'm ahead or behind helps me when it's slow. I go home, I work out, I go to the grocery store, I take my dog for a walk. Or when it's busy, I think about I'm banking these hours so that when it's slow, I don't feel guilty or I'm not as worried. Because the hardest thing about this job is the ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's a 24, it feels like it's a 24/7 job. Sometimes you're like, I'm never gonna hit my hours. No one's gonna give me work again. And that also plays into mental health. So yeah, the billable hour, it just is what it is. And when I post about it on LinkedIn, inevitably someone's triggered and they just cannot fathom that you can live and breathe under the billable hour and make it work. And they just want to bash it. And there are valid reasons to bash it, but no one has yet to give me an alternative. And so most clients pay for your work by 0.6 or yeah, tenths of an hour, 6-minute increments. And there are these things called alternative fee arrangements. They're not quite contingency fees, but it's more like we're going to pay you 50 grand for XYZ. Associates and partners we still have to track our time, even if we're under those fee arrangements. So it just is what it is. That's how I've come to see it.
I love that, I gotta be honest. First, I'd just like to say I appreciate the raw honesty. I appreciate the honesty about the experiences that you went through. Very similar, not exactly similar, but a couple episodes ago, I had Owen McGran on, and he spoke about some honest things, some honest experiences he's had in his life. And I always say it's so important to tell those stories because, like you said, there's people out there who are experiencing the same things, and when they hear your story, they can connect with you on just on a human level that's so much more different than anything that ever exists in this world. So I think it's so important to first tell those stories. And I think it's something that you used the word that got me. And it's a new Nate word that I like to see all the time. Reframe is something that you said that I love that word now because the way that it's used and the way you put it in your brain is sort of it can help you sort of change the framework of your thinking and change the way that you think, change the way that you view things, your perception of everything. My philosophy major within me is coming out a little bit. I always try to hold it down, but I think something like reframe is just so important. Now, something else that I saw that I wrote down for some reason because it's in like your header. It says you're a tennis player. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, of course. And I will say one thing about reframe is I'm not for positivity for the sake of being positive, but I am a generally positive person. And I think that's why it's important for me to separate myself from the just incessant negativity around the billable hour and reframe it and look at it a little differently and as a tool. On tennis, I have played tennis since I was 5. If people who know me out in the real world will not be shocked to know that I prefer it because I can play singles and not be on a team. I'm all about teamwork, but when I'm playing doubles, I always feel like I'm letting my partner down. And when it's just me versus someone else, it's one of the only things in my life where I only think about that sport, about tennis when I'm on the court. I'm not thinking about work. I'm not thinking about my life. I'm just focused on the game. And I played from age 5 through my freshman year of college. I played club tennis at Wake. It was very intense, and tennis for me has always been that outlet, right? I could have been a competitive travel tennis player, but it was always my outlet from school while I was focusing on academics. So after my freshman year at Wake, I did not play again until I moved to Milwaukee in 2013 after law school. And that was a big goal of mine, was to get back to tennis. And Milwaukee has an incredible tennis community. I must admit, I had only played inside one other time in my life, and now, it's mainly what I do. I stopped again in 2020 because I injured my shoulder, but I'm now back to playing anywhere from 1 to 3 days a week. And it just gives me something to look forward to. And again, it is wholly separate from work. Although I'll admit the networking I did through tennis when I first moved here is how I got my job at my first firm. So it can be a good tool in that regard as well. But I'm a big advocate of having a hobby. You have to have something that you do outside of school, outside of your job, that just brings you joy. And maybe it's a sport, maybe it's art, maybe it's movies, whatever it is, just something that's just for you.
Yeah, I agree more than anything in this world, the importance of having hobbies. I have many hobbies myself, as no one can see, but I'm wearing my Chelsea jersey right now, which is probably not a great hobby to have right now since we're in 11th. But it's all right. We'll get better someday, hopefully. So it's a good hobby, but sometimes it gets a little sad. I love watching wrestling though. I'm a very big fan of professional wrestling, which may I don't think it's controversial at all. Maybe a bit kiddish, but I don't mind. I love it.
No, it's for you,
I
right? It's
know.
what
See?
anyone else thinks.
I get immense joy from it, I have to say. I enjoy the intricacies, and I have a tendency, I'm the type of person when I get into something, I have to learn every single little thing. So like I spent like 3 months just looking at the whole history from like 1950 all the way to now.
Cool.
What happened, all that stuff. So I'm very knowledgeable, but it's a hobby because I enjoy learning about it. I'm like, oh, this is cool, and I can
Yeah.
keep it here. But you said something before you were talking about your tennis experience, you talked about networking. So now I have to ask about networking. How important and integral has networking been for your life?
Networking is incredibly important. So part of the reason I didn't go home to Georgia for law school, or after law school or after my clerkship is because it was extremely important to me to make connections that had nothing to do with my parents and their legal worlds. And I love and admire them, and they've done really incredible things, but I wanted to make a name for myself. And I was very lucky. It scared me at first, if I'm being honest, but my judge was like, "You're not from here. You need to be active in these bar associations." So right away, I got involved in the federal bar. And then as soon as I passed the bar, I got involved with the Young Lawyers Division of our state bar. And if my judge was like, "You should go to this," I went. And 10 years later, I this I know I'm not supposed to qualify it, but I know almost everyone in the Milwaukee legal community, right? I can go to events, talk to people, not be nervous. It was terrifying in the beginning. And what that has all really taught me is thinking back to on-campus interviews and OCIs. I should have been doing that throughout law school. I should have been going to Jackson, Mississippi, and meeting attorneys and, basically convincing them that I was truly interested in Mississippi and staying there. And that probably would have helped me throughout OCIs. I know that helps me today. So I have one really good example of current third year at University of Wisconsin at Madison's law school connected with me through a legal mentoring network. He drove the relationship, did regular check-ins, shared his resume with me. It was of the caliber that my firm works for or looks for. I randomly ended up being the person who interviewed him for his on-campus interviews and then was able to vouch for him. He came to my firm as a summer associate, killed it, and is starting at my firm in the fall. Now, that's the dream. I'll probably do that maybe for one other person in my career, but I meet with law students all the time. And I tell them 9 out of 10 people might ignore your call or email, but you just need one person to respond. Because if I talk to them and then they say, "Emily, is there anyone else in your network that you think would talk to me?" I pass that along and it just builds on itself. And you just become more comfortable putting yourself out there and building a thicker skin when people ignore or ghost you. So it's incredibly important.
Yeah, I know that. I know that reality. I very much practice putting myself out there. I challenged myself earlier this year before I started the podcast. I'm like, Nate, you got to put yourself out there. Got to make it known who you are. And even before that, there was that noise. There's always that noise that comes in. Like, oh, what would people think? What are they gonna think? What are they gonna say? But it doesn't matter. It never has mattered ever. You just got to go and do it. And I've learned immensely. Learned very much to put myself out there. Got to be an open book, got to be honest. And I think rejection is really nothing. It's the worst that can happen. It's literally
Right.
what they say no. Like I'm so sorry if you're listening and I'm in your LinkedIn inbox. I've messaged about 30 trillion people at this point, and I don't really plan on stopping. So I'm so sorry, everyone. But I've gotten people leave me on red, and it's totally okay. I get it. Maybe they don't have time, but it's not for me to figure out. All right, next person. You just keep messaging.
Exactly. And when
Um,
I got started on LinkedIn, so we've kind of touched on it, I now post almost every day on LinkedIn original content that I create and write. And when I first started, I was very skeptical and nervous and imagined that like 80-year-old partner in my ear saying, we don't talk about these things, let alone on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn wasn't really being used by a ton of people 3 years ago in the way it is now. And I'm fortunate to have been on the early wave of that. But putting myself out there has been the most incredible thing, like even down to having this conversation with you, right? So many opportunities, and the legal community on both LinkedIn and Twitter are 98% of the time extremely positive and supportive and really safe spaces to talk about the realities of this job.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more. As much as I'm not a law student did not pass the bar, I'm not a lawyer, but I definitely can see when I'm scrolling through my LinkedIn, I'm looking at other people's posts. It is a very supportive community, it is a very large support system, and people, I'm telling you, are always willing to hear you out, to listen to you, hear what you have to say. Like just like yourself, I'm coming onto this podcast. I reached out to you and the 32 other people that I reached out previously, they all came on, they all helped me out, they all came on, had a good episode, and I can't complain. It's such a wonderful thing. There's so many wonderful people out there. You just got to make that text message, you just got to make that phone call, that email, and you're through. But Emily, we are down to our last four questions. The first question is live on Lawyers in the Making podcast. What are Emily's book recommendations? It doesn't have to be about law, it could just be about anything. But what are some of your favorite books?
Okay, I was not a reader growing up, and then I became a history major and a Spanish major, and you read a ton. That caught me off guard in being in a language major. I read a ton, and then you go to law school and you read a ton. So back in 2019, I made it a goal to read more. And late in 2023, I found this is going to sound crazy cozy murder mysteries. So it's like, think like Murder She Wrote, or not like NCIS, like not the most gruesome murder mysteries. They're often written by a British author and they're delightful. So one is the Marlowe Murder Club. And one is I believe it's called the Thursday Murder Club. And they're both series and they're just so pleasant. It's often like octogenarians solving murders, and it's just incredible. So that's what I've been enjoying lately. I just love reading personal development books. That's so cliche given what I write about on LinkedIn, but one author that really comes to mind is Cal Newport, and he's actually a math professor, but he wrote a book called Deep Work that really helped me reframe and rethink about time management and how to find blocks of time. Because, like in college, I had tons of time to just go to the library and study for hours. You lose that time in a job. So, how to find it again. And I'm currently reading a book of his called Digital Minimalism. And
Mhm.
it's basically how to keep in check your relationship with technology. And it's interesting because he does advocate for at least brief stints of stepping away from technology, but with an understanding that you can't walk away from it forever because it's so ingrained in our society. So it's really just a check on finding solitude, really, in this connected universe. Another one that I really loved was Brene Brown's The Gifts of Imperfection. A lot of attorneys really struggle with perfectionism. I think type A individuals are drawn to this job. And perfectionism is a disease. And so the gift of imperfection really helped me put that in a new perspective.
This is I believe either the third or fourth time we've gotten to Cal Newport. After the second time, I was finally like, all right, I got to check this guy out. So I have listened to a couple of his podcast episodes. He was actually recently on the Tim Ferriss show. I love Tim Ferriss.
Mhm.
I love you, Tim. But he was on the Tim Ferriss show, so I listened to that episode, and he is really, really wonderful. And he, as the normal pop culture would say, he's spitting facts.
Yeah.
And he certainly is. I haven't been able to get through his books yet, but I have to now because people keep talking about him. But he's definitely been popping up all over the place on everything that I see. Everyone's talking about Cal Newport. So he's a very valuable source. So I suggest him to anyone because he really, really does break it down. He really breaks down the sort of modern age, the technological age that we're in, and how to sort of survive in it and be able to keep our attention on something for a long amount of time because the social media is out there. They're designed to
It's
make
rough.
you keep scrolling. They
Yeah.
are scientifically designed. The algorithms are, and they kill your attention span. And Cal Newport is trying to revive it for all of us. So thank you, Cal Newport, for your contributions in that light. But
Absolutely.
third to last question now on the topic of social media, what are the types of things that you consume, not food, consume on a daily basis, either that be through social media, so Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Reddit, Substack, what are some of your favorite people if you have? What's crossing the transom of Emily's mind on a daily basis?
So I spend a lot of time on law Twitter and law LinkedIn, whatever we want to call it. That's where I do most of my content creation. I've had to take a break from TikTok for all the reasons we just discussed. But what I loved about TikTok was how niched down you could get. So I found corporate millennials with anxiety TikTok. And I was like, these are my people. I'm just like, I'm not crazy. Like, yes, they get it. And then I love pop culture. I love television. I don't watch a ton of reality TV, but I love certain pockets of reality TV, like MTV's The Challenge, Top Chef, which is coming to Milwaukee. It premieres in 9 days. Real Housewives, anything on Bravo, really, for the most part. And so I'm often in that sort of space on Twitter, which then gets me into shows I don't watch, like RuPaul's Drag Race or Love Island. And I recently got into the Traitors, season 2 of the Traitors US. Chef's Kiss. It was such a good show. Um, and then I love college football. So come the fall, that's what you'll find me kind of reading about in my free time.
Are you an Old Miss fan? I'm assuming so.
I am an Ole Miss fan, and I grew up a Georgia fan, so it's been a really good couple of years for us. So I'm fortunate in that I have 3 teams I can root for: Georgia, Wake, and Ole Miss. It's rare they're all good at the same time, but Ole Miss is gonna make a run for it this year, I think. So I'm excited.
I hope so. I used to watch a ton of college football. I don't watch it so much because I've replaced it with the other football, but I know Ole Miss very well. I'm a Giants fan. I love Eli Manning. with all my
Eli.
heart. He's an absolute doll. Thank you.
I
Um,
went to church with him. So,
really?
but he lives, or when I was at Ole Miss during the off season, he lived in Oxford, Mississippi. And I'll never forget being at church, taking communion, and I turn around and there's Eli and his whole family in the back of the church. Or like Ole Miss is not a big town. And I was at this bar after a game and I went, oh, I bumped into someone. I was like, excuse me. And it was Archie Manning. The Mannings are a huge deal at Ole Miss.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. But this is also the second time someone's brought up the Real Housewives. I actually I don't watch the Real Housewives anymore, but my mom used to watch it all the time. So like when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I'd be sitting on the couch and she'd put it on and like she'd be in her room. So I just like sit there with her because I was bored. And I've seen every single one, Atlanta, New York, New Jersey's my favorite, I have to say. Orange County. I love them all. I think it's probably New Jersey's my favorite. And then
I
I
loved Caroline Manzo with a passion.
like
Her and her family, everything about them.
and then I definitely say Atlanta second. I know Atlanta the best out of all of them. Orange County's cool too. I never really
Okay,
got
so you have to watch Traders then because Phaedra from Real Housewives of Atlanta is on it and it's like her redemption story. You know, she rightfully got kicked off of Real Housewives of Atlanta and then she's on Traders and she's won our hearts all over again. It's so good.
and oh, that's amazing. And then I heard you say MTV. So I love the Jersey Shore. One of my favorite shows ever.
Yeah.
It
They
used
were, that was a little, they really started while I was in college when I sort of stopped being able to
yeah.
watch MTV as much. But yeah, I mean, Snooki is part of, the cultural zeitgeist, as they would say.
She's a queen in and all, I have to say. I love all the wacky characters are amazing because it's really them. They're not wacky characters. That's my favorite part. I'm like, this is just authentically these people. But second to last question here, Emily. You're always working, doing those billable hours, but what does an ideal Friday night and Sunday morning look for Emily?
Okay, Friday night's easy. It's my husband and I are foodies. Milwaukee has a great food scene. So we're going out and enjoying a lengthy dinner. At one of our favorite restaurants or a new restaurant. And then coming home and snuggling our dogs on the couch. We have two English bulldogs. So Sunday morning is somewhat similar, sleep in, spend time with our dogs, and then like usually go to brunch and then the grocery store, with no real time frames, right? Just as we get to it.
Listen, I love the simple answers. The simple answers are always the best for that question. But Emily, the final question here, I do this at the end of every episode. What are your words of wisdom for the aspiring law students, the current law students, and even the legal professionals out there in the world?
For everyone, it's really just be yourself. I think there is this tendency when you have these big goals to compare yourself and think, I need to do this exact thing at this exact time, at this exact type of school. And that's just all noise. It's so important at some point to sit down and say, what do I want? And then go get it and do it no matter what it looks like. And then when you're in it, bring your full self to the table. So I spent probably the first 3 to 4 years of my legal career in a firm trying to fit a role, right? Not really being myself or like doing things like I do now on LinkedIn. And I just wasn't happy. And it was as soon as I really thought, what do I want? What makes sense for me? And I started moving towards that, that I found that contentment again and started really loving my job again. And I can think through, like, I'm very grateful for all of my life experiences, but a lot of it was just doing what I was told to do or what I thought other people expected of me. And that led me to a certain degree of success, but the fulfillment came when I started to really think about and do what I wanted to do. Sometimes that aligned with what others wanted for me, and sometimes it didn't, but it didn't matter because I was fulfilled.
That's beautifully poetically said, Emily. But that is the podcast. So, Emily, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your wisdom, sharing your experiences. And for everyone out there listening, check us out at lawyersinthe.making.substack.com, and I will see you in the next one.